So the Iran peace agreement was signed, right? Well, and now things have gone south again? This morning there's been another wave of turmoil. As for Vance, he was originally scheduled to go to Geneva on Monday, but now he's not going. Why? Let me tell you the real and accurate situation right now. The second piece of news is that the G7 has actually achieved remarkable results, but the target is very clear. Do you know who it is? Okay, and third, is Cuba about to undergo a major change? What's really behind the large-scale economic reforms that have made it onto Cuba's agenda? All right, welcome to Good Morning America, brought to you by Fangway. Hello to all our YouTube viewers, and greetings to everyone listening on Silicon Valley FM 96.1. Okay, let's get straight to the point. First, let's talk about the conclusion of the negotiations between the United States and Iran. Yesterday, I spent a lot of time breaking it down for everyone. What exactly is the situation? In other words, the agreement looks very weak, but Vance's explanation is actually very strong. So to put it simply, it's like giving candy as a reward for good behavior. To put it in more vivid terms, none of this is actually reflected in the agreement itself. Regarding easing sanctions, unfreezing assets, and reconstruction funds, these reward Iran, but the deal lacks performance-based rewards, sparking criticism. That's why Vice President Vance frequently defended this in the media. Including at White House press conferences, he kept repeating this point. So what was the result? Well, this morning, Trump tweeted that we didn't meet with Iran out of desperation. They're the desperate ones. They're finished. We're going to see out these 60 days, and they won't get any money, not a single cent. What does that mean? It means that within these 60 days, they won't get a penny. That's what the agreement says. Because the wording of the agreement is pretty weak, it has caused some misunderstandings, making people think that Iran would get the money right away. All those benefits for Iran, right? Beyond easing oil sanctions, they'll get $300 billion in unfrozen assets and reconstruction funds. Trump's point is, if talks fail, there will be nothing at all. That's what it means, nothing at all. So this really is consistent with what Vance said. Rewards are given based on performance. Even though it's not written in the agreement, that's how it actually works. So I've noticed a pattern. Trump's negotiations are often pretty flexible. It's very easy for him to get the other side to sign, but behind the scenes, he's actually very strict. Especially if the other side casually agrees to something, he'll latch onto that and never let go. So when Japan was negotiating with Trump back then, they also thought the talks went really well, but afterward, they were extremely surprised. But actually, during the negotiations, whatever Trump said, maybe the other side didn't deny it. That ends up becoming part of the actual agreement. But anyway, in the end, everything got resolved. So that's the situation. What I want to share with everyone here is that we're also trying to understand exactly how Trump's negotiation process works when dealing with other countries. All right, so what about now? Logically, the agreement was signed on Wednesday night. So in Iran, it was Thursday morning when it was signed. So when do these 60 days actually start? Well, they start from Thursday. So originally this weekend, because things are moving nonstop, right? Out of 60 days, how many weekends do you really get? Not that many, maybe 8 or 9 weekends, right? So Vance is the lead negotiator. So really, just like I said over a month ago, if there was going to be an agreement, it would come down to just two things. The first is the blockade of the strait. Both sides would completely relax their positions. The second is that they would negotiate for another 60 days, and that's it. So these 60 days are the real tough part. That's the hardest, the truly difficult period. And as for the lead negotiator, now it's very clear. Vance has already told reporters at the press conference that it's him, yeah. So now Vance is heading to Geneva for what's called the negotiations. This window of opportunity opened, but it was interrupted right from the start. Why? Because fighting broke out again in Lebanon, and the U.S.-Iran negotiations were temporarily halted. Vance was no longer going to Geneva. What happened? Hezbollah in Lebanon attacked Israeli troops in southern Lebanon. They hit an Israeli tank, resulting in 4 deaths and multiple injuries. Such heavy losses for Israel are actually quite rare. So Israel launched a massive counterattack, striking 80 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, including 2 Hezbollah command centers. So this also highlights that both sides are really going at it. And it also shows that the biggest structural weakness in the peace agreement is Lebanon. What does that mean exactly? What is Iran's view on Lebanon? What I'm about to say are the exact words of Arakshi, the Iranian foreign minister. He said, "In our view, the two parties to this Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, are on one side the United States and Israel, and on the other side Iran and Hezbollah. From now on, any military strike by Israel against Lebanon, as well as any continued occupation of Lebanese territory, will be regarded by us as a violation of this Memorandum of Understanding." But for Israel, they think this is nonsense. What does it have to do with us? We were never part of the negotiations. The U.S. signed it, but we never even saw the agreement. So how could we possibly be tied to the U.S. and negotiate with you? So Israeli officials have stated that their troops will continue to remain in the large areas of southern Lebanon that they have occupied over the past 3.5 months. Also, the Israeli Minister of National Security, named Benji VR, said, "President Trump's agreement doesn't bind us," is what he said, right? I think what he said is absolutely correct. Because Israel really didn't participate in the negotiations, nor did it sign anything. So there's no reason to say it would be bound by it. This is just Iran's wishful thinking. So how does the United States see it? Well, for the US, it's clearly about President Trump's personal influence. He hopes to be able to restrain or influence Israel. So Trump didn't directly point at Iran and say, "You're talking nonsense." All right, so what's the result if things keep going like this? First, Israel will be dissatisfied with the United States. Has the U.S. made a clear statement? No. The U.S. has already stated multiple times, if the U.S. doesn't act, we'll do it ourselves. And by do it ourselves, they mean taking action against Hezbollah. Whether it's against Hezbollah or against Lebanon, Israel's stance has now drawn a response from Vice President Vance. Yesterday, at a White House press conference, Vance lectured Israel, saying publicly, "Remember, the only head of state who protects you is the United States. There isn't a second country in the world, and it just so happens that this country is the world's most powerful superpower, so you need to show some self-respect." He also said that 2/3 of Israel's weapons are made by us, so you'd better get this straight. Now, there are already Israeli cabinet members starting to criticize Trump. He said, "At least your prime minister hasn't criticized us, but shouldn't you do something about your cabinet ministers?" Is what he said true? Yes, it's true. But the attitude, saying it so openly, really makes it hard to swallow. It comes across as pretty condescending. But Israel wasn't having it. They immediately fired back. The Israeli defense minister said, "We shared our intelligence with you right away. The U.S. military has benefited a lot from our intelligence and innovations." What he was really implying was that they don't owe the U.S. anything. Actually, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So now what everyone's concerned about is whether this will cause a rift between Israel and the United States. Let me tell you straight up, it won't. It absolutely won't. Just like Europe and the US won't break apart, Israel and the US won't either. Sure, they'll argue, they'll get upset with each other, but fundamentally, whether you call it shared interests or shared ideology, their core is aligned. They are the same team. So I think it's just some bickering, nothing more. So is Vance not going to Geneva really a big deal? Actually, it's not, because just yesterday at noon, Vance already said he might not go. At that time, he said that going to Geneva would require a long trip, not for him, but for the Iranians. For them, it's like coming out of hiding. Just getting out of Iran is a challenge, and even figuring out how to catch a flight is a problem. So they might not even make it over the weekend, so they never really planned on going for sure. And now, with this conflict going on, it's even less likely they'll go. So what's the latest news? There's already been a ceasefire. That's why I said it won't break apart, right? I said it wouldn't break apart. And as I mentioned earlier, the ceasefire news came out about half an hour ago. So Hezbollah and Israel have already agreed to a ceasefire. And in fact, this round of fighting was really initiated by Hezbollah. It wasn't started by Israel. So if Iran wants Lebanon to avoid renewed conflict, they can achieve this by restraining Hezbollah and stopping them from attacking Israel. So if Israel isn't being attacked and then insists on launching attacks or deliberately sabotaging the agreement, Israel wouldn't do something like that. But at the same time, Israel can't just accept being attacked, especially when their soldiers have been killed. And it's absolutely impossible for Israel not to retaliate. If they don't, the attacks will just keep coming. So that's the situation. So even though it's dangerous and a weak link, in my opinion, it's not a major issue. Now for today's news. We have major stories on technology, Cuba's reforms, and the Chinese Communist Party. Beyond timely updates, I'll analyze what these headlines really mean and provide the deeper context you need. So for new viewers, please remember to click subscribe. Just hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of my shows. All right, let's start by talking about this. Where do the American people stand on the Iran deal? A new poll just came out, conducted by the Reagan Institute in Simi Valley, California. This poll was carried out by the Reagan Institute and was completed in early June. This poll was quite interesting. If you look at Americans' views on the Iran peace agreement, it's actually not a poll conducted after the agreement was signed, but rather one done beforehand. It reflects the general public's attitude toward how to resolve the Iran issue. 39% of respondents support resolving the issue through negotiations. In other words, allowing the Iranian regime to stay in power, but restricting its nuclear weapons, and to limit its missile program. Meanwhile, 36% support regime change. So whether to push for regime change in Iran or to negotiate with Iran, in other words, whether to resolve the issue through negotiations or by changing the regime, the public is almost evenly split. So what does this show about the mindset of Americans? Basically, they can't make up their minds. Then there are another 16% who believe in supporting a weakened Iranian regime. In other words, allowing the current regime to stay in power, but significantly weakening it militarily and economically. To put it bluntly, that basically means doing nothing. And 8% said, I don't know. Now, if you break down these numbers further, 51% of Republicans support regime change. 25% support negotiating a solution, so that's a 2-to-1 ratio. Now, the Democrats are really interesting here. 52% support negotiating a solution and 25% support regime change. It's exactly the opposite. In other words, among Republicans, the ratio of support for regime change to negotiation is 2-to-1, while for Democrats, it's the other way around, or you could say it's 1-to-2. That's the situation. All right, so this survey by the Reagan Institute was conducted from May 26th to June 3rd, and it was a nationwide poll of 1,555 respondents. So there are a few things to note here. First, Americans can't seem to make up their minds. The second point I want to share with everyone is about U.S. foreign policy, actually. Let me tell you, it's actually not that important, not as important as you might think. Why? Because that's just how Americans are. From my observation, ordinary Americans aren't that interested in international affairs. Less than 30% care. In fact, many people never leave the country their whole lives. Yeah, it's really true. Is there any need to travel abroad? Life in America is already pretty good. Yeah, it's really comfortable and free here. Actually, America isn't necessarily wealthy, you know? Some people come to the US, come to New York, and see all these rundown houses, old and shabby. America isn't as good as our country, right? Even just a few days ago, I had some Japanese friends visit here. He said, in Japan, we really admire America, but when we actually come to the US, how come it's like this? His feelings are real. They really are. Actually, in many ways, America's infrastructure and level of modernization can't compare to a lot of other countries now, but America has something that other countries don't. It's that Americans are very free. There's a lot of freedom and comfort. In this country, in everyday life, there are very few things that really get on your nerves. This is a special kind of happiness you experience living in America. The government doesn't constantly make your life difficult. But you can't say that as a person. Everyone in life, most things don't go your way, right? So of course there are things that get on your nerves. For Chinese people living in America, usually it's personal stuff or issues between yourself and your company or your boss, things like that. So it's rarely the government causing you that kind of stress. It's very rare because this is a free country, and that's a unique kind of happiness you find in America. So what the government provides to its people is a kind of luxury, a real privilege, which is that you don't have to worry about national or international affairs, and you can still live your life comfortably and at ease. So when it comes to US presidential elections or midterm elections, what people usually vote on are domestic policies. Even though we keep talking about Iran being a headline issue every day, the truth is that's not what ordinary Americans care about. What they care about is the price of gas, the price of groceries when they go shopping at the supermarket. So what really determines US elections are domestic issues and, most importantly, the economy. That's just how it is. So why did President Trump want to end the war with Iran? To put it plainly, he just stopped halfway and pulled out. And why withdraw in this way? At least it looks relatively dignified, right? The fundamental reason is domestic politics. If the US causes oil prices to rise, ordinary people won't be distracted by whatever Vance or anyone else is saying. They'll just vote you out of office. If President Trump can't stay in office, then I think he won't be able to do anything at all, right? Basically, it's like the stage under his feet has been pulled out. How could he possibly keep performing? There's no point talking about how to put on a show anymore. There's simply no show left to perform. So in a certain sense, this is also a conflict between Meloni and Trump. As everyone knows, during the US-Iraq war, Italy's prime minister, who was a conservative and originally a good friend of Trump, and also a good friend of Musk, Meloni really offended Trump. Italy wouldn't allow the US military to land in Italy. The US Air Force bases in Italy wouldn't allow American military planes to land, so Trump was extremely angry. Also, there's Maloney, and then the Pope. The Pope criticized what he called America's war, and then he was criticized by the US government in return. Maloney offended Trump when she went to defend the Pope. So, a couple of days ago, in the town of Avion in France, during the G7, Maloney had to deal with Trump in the media. Do you know what happened after that? So 2 days later, it seemed like nothing had happened. An Italian journalist found Trump for an interview and asked him about the experience. Trump said, "Let me tell you something. Your prime minister wanted to take a photo with me, but I didn't want to take a photo with him. I just felt sorry for him, so I agreed to take one. Actually, I didn't want to. Trump has a big mouth, right? Well, maybe that's not the right way to put it. Calling him a big mouth isn't exactly diplomatic, but Trump doesn't care about that. He just speaks his mind and says whatever he's thinking. A lot of people don't like that, but a lot of people really do. Once he said it, that's it. There's nothing more to it. As a result, this whole thing started to blow up in Italy right at this moment, spreading rapidly. So it damaged the relationship between the US and Italy and ruined the event's atmosphere. All of Italy was outraged, but the media's exaggerating by saying they're furious. I don't think so. So the issue is that Trump was unhappy with Maloney. When you're in front of me, you agree to everything, we share the same values, and yet you wouldn't let the US military land. Why? Because for Maloney, if she were to go along with the US-Iran war on these international policies, she could lose her position. Whether it was instinctive or intentional, the point is he just didn't let the US military land because he couldn't afford to offend his voters. That's his domestic politics. If he offends his voters, he won't be prime minister anymore. So how could he go talk to Trump about this or that policy? Right? This is exactly the kind of problem that comes from Western policies like this. Honestly, there's nothing they can do about it. Maybe after making the decision, they think, that's not really what I wanted. But at the time, say you're the Pope and you're in Italy, how could I not support the Pope? But deep down, I think that's probably what they were really thinking. I'm just putting on a show on the surface. When I see Trump, I still act like nothing happened and go meet with him. But Trump actually cares about it. How can you play both sides like that? So that's how this whole commotion started. But honestly, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Still, this is exactly what I mean when I talk about the nature of Western democratic politics. It's a phenomenon, or you could say a kind of problem. It really is a problem. Anyway, that NBC, just a couple of days ago, they did a poll. Of course, the poll was full of negative factors for Trump in every aspect. Honestly, I usually don't give much credit to NBC's polls because they keep lying over and over again. You want me to take their numbers seriously now, to look at them and treat them as credible? That's just not possible. So they have no credibility. But anyway, they gave an example, and I think this example makes sense. They quoted a Republican voter from West Virginia. West Virginia is a red state, and they found a Republican voter there. He complained that prices are totally out of control, saying even ordering a pizza is now for the rich. He also said, Trump has let me down. He's distracted by war. His reaction makes sense and represents a segment of grassroots and independent voters. When it comes to Iran, they're unlike our audience. We know there's an evil regime there, backed by the CCP, right? It matters for the world's future. But Americans care more about their own lives. They don't worry about the world, since the US manages things well locally. They can ignore the rest of the world, reflecting US political reality. So in this situation, I don't know if everyone can understand Trump or not, but the reason he wants to pull back is largely related to this. However, if things really get pushed to the edge, if Iran is forced to block the strait, if Iran is forced to develop nuclear weapons, would Trump just ignore it, or would he go and attack? He probably would. I've always said that he would. He has to consider domestic politics, but he doesn't care about national politics the way a typical politician would, just serving domestic interests. He still has his own principles. But if he can take domestic concerns into account without causing too much trouble, he will do it. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear. I'm trying to give an accurate description of the state I've read about Trump. All right, let's take a look at this short news piece. China also supports the US-Iran peace agreement. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone conversation with Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi on Friday, expressing that China welcomes Iran and the US signing the first phase of the Memorandum of Understanding. It has been proven that force and power cannot solve problems. Dialogue and negotiation are the right choices, and so on. He said that the navigation issues in the Strait of Hormuz have been properly resolved, and that common concerns of the international community should be appropriately addressed. All right, let me translate that for you. Basically, it means that the Chinese Communist Party has always encouraged Iran to stir up trouble in the Middle East to confront the United States. They want to distract and divert the United States by stirring up trouble in different parts of the world so that the US can't focus on the Chinese Communist Party. This has always been one of the CCP strategies. But if the US attacks Iran and Iran ends up blocking the strait, the fire will immediately spread to the CCP itself. China is the world's largest oil importer and the biggest buyer of oil. So if that happens, their economy will immediately take a heavy hit. That's why they have no choice but to change their rhetoric. On one hand, they're still secretly supporting the war, but on the other hand, they're also starting to support peace. Deep down, they're really worried. If this keeps going, what's going to happen to their economy? Right now, China's economic situation is extremely severe, probably more severe than most people can even imagine. Yeah, but for this topic, I actually want to spend some time making a special segment to help everyone understand what's really going on with China's current economic situation. But no matter how tough things are for China's economy today, it might actually be the best it will be for the next few years. Why is that? Let me explain to everyone. The next topic is the G7 summit. What kind of results came out of the G7 summit? The leaders of the Group of Seven wrapped up their meeting this Wednesday and issued a joint statement. The joint statement covered a number of areas, but one of the main points was a collective reaffirmation of their opposition to any unilateral changes to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. At the same time, they pledged to strengthen cooperation on rare earth supply chains and reiterated their firm commitment to maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific region. And their unified stance? Then, regarding the defense of Ukraine, increasing sanctions against Russia, and the situation in the Middle East. The Group of Seven reached a high level of consensus. French President Macron even called this summit a moment of strategic awakening. There are a few key points I want to highlight here. The first is that although France hosted the summit, it was the United States that footed the bill. Basically, France was just playing the role of a servant. The real host was Trump. The United States was the true host. This time, the Group of Seven invited many people from around the world who are involved in international security. So in essence, it became a de facto United Nations Security Council for solving global security issues. A Security Council of United Countries, not the official UN Security Council. Because in this setup, the Chinese Communist Party and Russia were completely excluded, so everything was easy to discuss and easy to handle. The talks went especially smoothly. That's why, even before this meeting, I said that Trump would definitely bring up many issues targeting the CCP, especially certain ones. The issue of economic and trade relations between the EU and the CCP, sure enough, as soon as the news came out, this turned out to be a major highlight. I'll talk about that in a bit. So the main joint statement from the summit was aimed at a series of policies concerning the CCP and Russia. You could even say that the entire summit statement was directly targeting the CCP. Before I get into the specifics, let me mention a little side note. South Africa wasn't criticized this time. You know, France wanted to invite South Africa, but Trump didn't allow France to invite South Africa because South Africa had offended Trump. So France obediently listened and didn't invite them. So you can see, this just proves that the United States is absolutely the boss, the head of the G7. That's the first highlight. The second highlight is that Trump showed himself as the master of the G7, and the G7 showed that there is no split between the US and Europe. Absolutely no split at all. Third, now the international community is about to shut the door on the CCP, in terms of trade and economics. France's attitude toward Beijing has clearly become tougher. This is according to AFP. So if Beijing doesn't change its current approach, it will see the global market and the European market closed off to China. Okay, as everyone knows, over the past 15 years, the CCP has built up 1/3 of the world's manufacturing. 1/3 of all global manufacturing is in China. So what about Xi Jinping? He took the lead in centralizing all production-related activities using administrative measures. This resulted in tremendous production efficiency and extremely low production costs. While Western systems rely on a free economy to make adjustments, the CCP accomplishes things through directives. In no time, they became dominant on a global scale. As a result, their products became extremely cheap, and the production volume was massive. You could ride an electric car and see a sea of them everywhere. But the problem is, even if you can make these products, can you actually sell them? Are people willing to buy them? Once other countries close their doors to you, the Chinese economy will collapse, and 1/3 of its manufacturing sector will become a liability, a huge burden that the CCP won't be able to handle. So, this massive manufacturing growth, what does it include? Government subsidies, administrative consolidation, state-owned firms competing globally, and currency manipulation. Making the RMB very cheap, which helps with exports and so on. There are all kinds of things like this. Also, what else? Things like infringing on intellectual property rights. So all these aggressive and forceful tactics have seemingly built up the world's #1 manufacturing sector, the top in the world. But the result is that you end up offending the whole world. There's a saying, if you mess around, you'll have to pay for it eventually. So when the time comes and everyone feels like they can't take it anymore, they start putting up high tariffs against you. Even if you have 20% or 50% of the world's manufacturing, it's useless if no one buys your products. So before this summit, I already said that the US would definitely urge Europe to make up its mind to address the issue of the CCP dumping goods in Europe. The solution is to raise the tariff barrier, so Europe is just slow, really slow. There's nothing you can do about it. The only person who can push Europe is Trump, and the only occasion to push Europe is the G7. So what did von der Leyen say? Yesterday, she said that when people look back at 2025, they'll remember this is the year when, for the first time, all member states had a trade deficit with China. Europe has recorded the largest trade deficit in its history. Let me tell you, Europe has created the largest trade deficit in human history, reaching as much as 360 billion euros. That's over 400 billion US dollars. He said, of course, this is unsustainable. Ma said the renminbi is undervalued by 20% to 30%, and this needs to be discussed. As everyone knows, the Trump administration had a characteristic: do more, talk less. Europe, on the other hand, talks more and does less. The Chinese Communist Party won't change either. So what's the point of talking about it? Just do it, that's all. When it comes to tariffs, in the US, it only takes a day to implement them. Europe, on the other hand, has to hold several meetings, countless meetings, right? So of course, that's just how things are in Europe. I've told you all before, in the first year of the American Revolutionary War, the US established what was called the First Continental Congress. This Congress was made up of representatives from the 13 colonies. A one-vote veto system,